Thank you so much, Simran. Hi, everybody. Seeing as how this is just after lunch, I'm going to start with a pop quiz. Does anybody here know? And because the topic obviously is how to mitigate compliance risk, with an effective regulatory change management program. So the question is going to be about regulations. Does anybody know how many regulations there are in the world?
Far too many.
Too many.
Exactly.
Okay, I'll admit I don't know the answer to that, but I did look up some facts and figures, right? So for instance, Brazil, right? Brazil has 33,619 regulations. Yeah. Does anybody know how many Spain has?
More.
That's higher or lower now.
That's correct. So the exactly, the number is 111,731. Does anybody know how many regulations the EU has?
Oh, no.
Actually, no. Guess. It has 87,241. Compared to that, take a guess how many France has.
Higher.
More. A lot more. So France has 645,913 regulations. And last but not least, India, where I grew up, 1.3 billion people. So how many? Just take a wild guess. How many regulations? Say that again.
100.
Not really. It's 1,399. Look. These numbers are national legislations. In reality, it's more complex than that, right? I mean, there are local regulations, there are regional regulations. So there are, in reality, millions. So, our job is to try and manage those. So to talk about this fascinating subject, right? I have an experienced panel with me. I'll request Kate, Phil, and Dominic to briefly introduce themselves, what they do for a living, and then we'll jump straight into it.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Kate Willis. I'm the Group Head of Compliance at the Ames Group. I spent 10 years at the FCA in enforcement, investigating systems and controls in wholesale banking, which always came down to change management, FYI. And then I moved into fintech, worked at Facebook in their global payments team, and then worked in a sort of variety of small and medium-sized fintech firms sort of doing international expansion.
Thank you. Phil.
Okay, so Phil Crook. I'm the Head of Compliance Advice at Nationwide Building Society. We are the biggest building society in the world and obviously specialising in UK retail financial services. We're the second biggest lender in the UK. And before I joined Nationwide this time last year, I'd spent 12 years at Lloyds Banking Group. I know also represented in the room. And I've worked across all three lines of defence and business and operations during my time at Lloyds, and my role at Nationwide is in the second line of defence.
Thank you, Phil.
Great. I am Dominique Conte. I'm Head of Compliance at the BBC. I don't think they need much of an introduction, but I can give you one if you like. And I'm responsible for the compliance programme across all of the BBC, designing and implementing the compliance strategy, the 3-year plan, and making sure that all checks and balances when it comes to compliance are in place. Compliance is my bread and butter. I've always been in the regulatory game. Prior to the BBC, I worked for O2 Telefonica, working on the Tesco mobile brand, doing a similar sort of role. Prior to that, I worked for the National Lottery, Betway, a number of other organisations, so various industries. I've come with, different views and insights into regulation in relation to them. And now I'm at the BBC.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dominic. So as you can see, 3 different organizations, different sizes, different industries. So we all think we know what regulatory compliance means or regulatory change means, but and we perhaps think that we have an idea about what the processes are involved. But given the diversity of these organizations, I'd like to perhaps first start by understanding from each of our panelists, what does regulatory change mean to them in the context of their own businesses, given that we have a financial services business, we have a crypto organization, and we have a broadcasting organization. So In no particular order, maybe Phil, if you want to start first.
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, regulatory change for financial services, and obviously financial services is a really broad bucket, but in firms like mine and most UK-centric firms, we've had a lot to deal with over the last 15 years. The sort of fallout from the financial crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, and then the UK's exit from the EU. They've all created their own challenges, and indeed that latter one's still ongoing in terms of what that means for regulatory change. I guess in terms of my own particular areas of expertise, if I roll back to when I first started working in financial services, treating customers fairly, TCF had just landed. It was a huge kind of game changer of all those kind of nasty banks and building societies that had done wrong during the financial crisis and really kind of tightening up for the benefit of UK consumers. And there's lots of other follow-on parts of regulatory change to that, and mentioned earlier in one of the presentations was the senior managers and certification regime, so sort of really encouraging accountability all the way through financial services organisations. What I would describe, and without wishing to sort of predict what my co-panellists are going to say, is that actually I think in comparison financial services had a relatively staid approach to regulatory change in those last 10, 15 years. It's felt very high volume, very fast paced. But in reality, it's particularly in the UK, it's always been a kind of evolving approach rather than something that's been revolutionised at any point. The look forward, however, is again in my area of expertise is around the FCA's Consumer Duty, which is a genuine game changer again for UK retail financial services, and that's going to mean how banks and building societies use data, some of the things that have been talked about over the course of today around AI, machine learning, around technology, and how we use that to either enhance the offering for our consumers or protect them. That's a significant regulatory change agenda for us.
Understood. So that's the view from a building society. Kate, your industry is adjacent to it. It's not, doesn't overlap. So how do you?
Yeah, so I work in the payments and the crypto space. So both of those markets globally are going through substantial changes or introduction of regulation, which is, so for me, change management is really how do I grow and expand the business and scale it in a way that isn't changing every other day, which is what sometimes it feels like, particularly in relation to crypto, because as the regulators start to understand it more, they start introducing new rules very quickly. And, you know, as a firm that wants to grow in different markets, we can't develop a process that all of a sudden needs to change the next week because one of our jurisdictions has introduced something new. So we have to keep on top of it all the time. We try to get involved a lot on the policy side to educate some of the regulators, particularly in the complexities of the technical side of crypto in particular, so that we can try and make sure that the regulations don't clash with how you can physically or technically do something within compliance. I've had conversations with the FCA where I've had to say, well, no, that's technically impossible. You cannot do that. and to explain, so that is why we don't have a control for it. So we have to do that globally to make sure that as we're expanding, the programs we're putting in place will still work. And so for me at the moment, it is about scaling. When I joined my firm a couple of years ago, I was the 6th employee. We're now nearly 100 globally and lots of different offices. And so we need to essentially be able to have a program that keeps working at that scale.
Thank you. I'm guessing the BBC has a completely different take on regulatory change management and compliance, Dominic?
Sort of. So obviously, given our global reach, we operate in a number of multiple jurisdictions, and that means that we are constantly navigating and managing compliance, with increasingly complex, volatile, and dare I say, often conflicting regulatory regimes that are just constantly increasing. The regulations are constantly increasing. And so for us, and definitely for me, regulatory change management is about bringing order to the chaos, right? So ensuring that we kind of have well-defined processes and a common system for monitoring and recording regulatory changes, measuring impact, understanding what changes therefore need to be implemented, whether it be to controls, policies, training, or whether that be to product updates. And it can be difficult. We are very much at the start of our journey from a compliance perspective in harnessing technology so that we can kind of use the benefits of technology to reduce time, reduce error, and kind of continue to meet the needs of our dynamic business. What I will say is that regulatory change management has definitely evolved for us over time. It's now an integral part of any effective compliance program or compliance framework. And I think as the high rate of regulations continue to increase, and as they continue to persist, particularly in response to geopolitical tensions, etc., I think we, and I have no doubt, along with other organisations, have kind of realised that uncoordinated change management, where the buck stops at the compliance team, just isn't going to cut it anymore. And what we actually are always trying to do is move towards a more scalable, structured, collaborative approach to meet our long-term regulatory change management needs.
Makes sense. And you mentioned technology, which kind of segue into my next question, which is really, I want to understand how do different firms, different organizations use technology to manage what is really a challenge of scale, given the number of regulations and related requirements. And again, I'm guessing that 3 organizations will have different ways of doing it. Now, there is a process, fairly well-established process that we follow, right? You look at the regulations, you analyze them, you check for impact on, is there an impact on a business or process? Does the control need to change? And then you do the assessment, and then you get people to make those changes. But I'm guessing each of you has a different insight. So again, in no particular order, Kate, if you want to...
Yeah, so obviously, I work in the fintech sector, so technology is sort of a core part of our business. But so going back to when I worked at the FCA, when investigating systems and controls, the main problems we were seeing throughout is fragmented processes, or sort of no one person or team knowing what is the A to Z of the process, who owns the data at A, who can amend it all the way through the life cycle. And that's where the errors and sort of the fines were arising from. And so when I moved into fintech, obviously I had the benefit of knowing the issues that can go wrong, and then how can technology help to improve that. So I'm very fortunate in a firm where the objective from the shareholders and the board has been sort of long-term stability and compliance. And so I can say now, from the very start, let's introduce this system because this will prevent X happening in the future. But I know certainly from sort of more established organisations, implementing that system now would be very different to where I am.
Yeah, I think it would be better if we'd have all started with technology rather than bringing it in further along the line. I mean, and I think, obviously I can only really speak for Nationwide Building Society, but I think, as you mentioned, any other established firm in retail financial services within the UK, there's a kind of, I think maturing would be about the most positive we could be as far as our use of technology is concerned. So my background prior to working in compliance was in operational risk, and so there's and indeed the same is true of credit risk as well, where there's a far greater maturity in how you use technology for the benefit of the organisation. You make it much more seamless for the business, and ultimately there's of course benefits and efficiencies to be gained from your lines of defence within that as well. And the same is true at Nationwide, and plug for the next session in the other room as well, where we're going to talk about this. But we've got Tara at the back of the room who actually coordinates our operational risk system, and that's something that we in compliance, touch wood, we haven't got anything that's broken, but we've taken an approach where the lack of technology and the reliance on EUCs and sort of spreadsheets hanging off of each other, it's not something that we're wrong to do, but it's not proactive to avoid doing something about that. And so that's why we're exploring our technology options as a result.
Understood. And the BBC point of view, Dominique?
Yeah, I think for me, I have a slightly different take, I think, because of my regulatory environment and my industry. So my view is that flashy tech can only take you so far. And I always say that before you even get to the tech, and you kind of touched on it before, there are a few kind of key components when it comes to regulatory change that if they're not in place, it doesn't really matter what tech you've got. So, I don't want to bore people because everyone in this room is probably well aware, but, talking about your centralised regulatory repository, what regulations are actually relevant to us and what do we need to be keeping our eye on? Secondly, are we ensuring that there is responsible governance when it comes to regulatory change management? So who is monitoring for new and updated regulations? Who's responsible for assessing the impact, whether they apply and then the impact to the business? Who is responsible for determining, what controls or anything that might need updating or what compliance gaps there currently are from where we are at this moment in time versus where we need to get to? Who's going to be creating the action plan and communicating that plan across the business and holding accountability? For me, this second part is crucial because accountability is the cornerstone, I think, for regulatory change management. Making sure that people know, okay, what is the information, that it gets routed to the right person, etc., etc. And then closely linked to that, it's making sure you have those workflow processes in place so that the right information is getting to the right person on time, and they can then trigger off the rest of the next steps that need to take place, the life cycle. And then also looking at how you're assessing the regulation so that it's kind of a consistent way across the board, across the enterprise. And then lastly, going back to that accountability bit, it's tracking from the beginning once you know that, okay, these regulations are changing, these things are coming down the line, okay, how are we tracking that through to make the necessary changes? And I always say that, the challenge that I have found as I've gone through all of those 5 key things, you'll see that accountability runs through all of that. And I have struggled, not necessarily at the BBC, but my challenge has been, getting everyone on board and holding that accountability throughout that regulatory change life cycle. For me, I see that ideally tech should be almost, it's the best way to put it, I don't know, just the add-on, right? The bonus to enable, you to either streamline processes, boost agility and operational efficiency, but it's not for us the be all and end all. Also, I think it's important to remember that depending on the organisation's regulatory environment, certain industries are less regulated than others. They're less subject to changes. Their regulations on nuance. I was saying to the guys who was coming in, I'm yet to meet a vendor that can meet the Ofcom regulations because they are on another kind of different scale to the FCA that applies across the board to so many entities. Depending on whether you're operating in multiple jurisdictions, whether you're focused on inorganic growth, all of these things will impact whether it's right to heavily invest in a tech solution. And so for me, it means that without having those other core components, you will struggle to have any real success when it comes to regulatory change management. That's just, my...
Sure, no, I understand. So the tech is important, but equally important, if not more so, are the processes, the governance, the systems. I wanted to ask you, so how important is the human resource part of it? And I'll tell you why I'm asking this. One of my customers that's actually going through this journey, one of their colleagues, she is a regulatory change expert, and she's leaving this organization. And the head of risk is quite concerned. She wants to get certain things done. So, it's from a fairly large team, one person leaving, and that seems to impact her a lot. So I'm keen to get your sense on the human resource.
The human resource is the most important part, because if the humans don't know what the tech is covering. So what data, what systems, what teams, what people who are accountable. If no human knows that, then the tech is never going to work. It's never going to achieve what you wanted it to achieve. And I think, historically I've seen that one of the key problems is at some point only one person knew the answer. Yeah. That person left the organisation and nobody picked up that knowledge. And so it broke. And so it goes back to, I guess, my A to Z point is that, I investigated a firm where one team owned A to C. Nobody else could change the data in those points. But if you made a change at point D, which impacted A to C, nobody knew that because it was a different team's responsibility. But this one person who since left the company, he knew. And so when I was interviewing this person who, left the organisation 5 years before, he was like, oh, yes. And nobody picked up that. So it's really important that the humans know it, document it, record it, and that if someone key is leaving, there's a good handover period and they pick up the right information that they need to. And if not, it's there documented somewhere.
Yeah.
Excellent. Look, I mean, this is a subject that I think we can go on and on, but I think in the interest of time, how much time do we have?
We have just about 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the last part of this, which is to really ask each one of you to kind of summarize what are the lessons learned, or maybe just advice that you want to pass on to others in the room. And if you can keep it as bullet points, maybe 2 or 3 bullet points. And then I do want to give the room a chance to ask questions if they have any. So again, in no particular order, I don't Phil,
I've got a couple. I think Dominique's point on accountability is absolutely essential. So right through every organisation, and like I say, some industries, I suppose, have more flexibility about how accountable you can ensure that your senior executives are. Like, it's non-negotiable in financial services. And so I think Dominique's point on accountability is spot on. I think the other piece on lessons learned is, which again has been touched on by my fellow panellists, is how you take the rest of the organisation with you. I think compliance people, and I dare say I've been guilty of it myself in the past, can sort of think that their view and their outlook on the world is the be-all and end-all. But the reality is that you're just one sort of small cog, really, in that much greater organisation. And I think if you lose that perspective, you're making your own life far more difficult.
Sure, thanks.
I think there's 3 things I would probably say. So the first is, in my mind, technology is king, but accountability and collaboration is queen. Yeah. Secondly, I'd say there's no one size fits all here, right? So what is right for one organisation might not necessarily be right for another. And I think that's really important to bear in mind and factor into any consideration on how to streamline or improve your regulatory change management programme or strategy, whatever. And then finally, I'd probably say this isn't really necessarily, it's related to what we're talking about, but one thing I have learned, and it's been touched on, is that your stakeholders need to be on this journey with you. If you forget about the stakeholders, you will either end up with a technology system that doesn't integrate well with what is currently happening from a risk perspective. So you have like compliance team, you have the risk team. They all need to talk to each other. Otherwise, what is the point? And how are you going to give a full picture up above that this is the lay of the land when it comes to risk management activities? So stakeholder buy-in is paramount. And I think that's what
makes sense, Dominic. Kate?
Along the same lines, so my first one would be know what problem is that you want to fix and why. So really be able to define what is the end goal. And then secondly, know who your stakeholders are. I won't sort of repeat any of the previous reasons other than to say sort of to make sure that you know absolutely everything about what that tech will be involved in. And then the third, which I don't think anybody else has touched on, is you're going to have to convince somebody to give you money. And so find out the benefits early on. And a lot of the tech these days is about streamlining processes, reducing human resource in areas where, if you look in some banks, you've got the checkers, those types of resource, which you shouldn't need to have that many of. So know your end goal, because that's the only thing that is going to convince someone to give you money, time, and energy into the project.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I think that's quite insightful. So I'm going to pause here and check if there are any questions that, or even a comment that anybody wants to make, what we've discussed. No? All right. So in that case, I'd like to thank my fellow panelists. Thank you so much for your insight and sharing your thoughts and experience. And I certainly am more knowledgeable about this. And I'm hoping that the audience here has also gotten some points, practical points that you can use in your day-to-day lives. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
you.